And GM fam, welcome to another Friday, another Llama party. And today we are joined by a guest that hopefully needs no introduction, but nonetheless, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself anyway, Mr. Adam S. Cochran.
Yeah, Adam Cochran, write too much on Twitter, and you've probably seen and loved or hated my threads.
I think everyone loves them. Is there anyone who actually hates them? I know there's some like some people have been
Well,
like
I
trying
think
to
it's
play as your nemesis or something. I think it's in good fun,
I
right?
think it's a bit of a divisive thing. You're on one side or the other of that issue. There's no one who likes threads. It's either pure vile hatred or love them. So
I mean, I have to admit that I've started mimicking your threading. I cannot get generally into double digits, whereas occasionally you'll drop these like 100 thread bangers. Have you made it to 1,000?
I have not. I think the largest one is high 200s, low 300s, but maybe one day we'll see.
Yeah, we have to hope. We have to hope. As much as I'd like to talk about threading techniques, I'm sure if we do that, we're not going to get anyone listening. So why don't we go ahead and like talk about some of the major stuff that's been happening in crypto? I don't know how long you have. Do you have like multiple hours to spend, or do you have a hard stop at any point?
Well, we can just go and until we can't go anymore and we run out of things to talk about, or I've got a new infant, and so if she starts crying up a storm, I may have to cut it
Of
earlier. But
understandable,
pretty flexible.
understandable. How is fatherhood going for you? How is fatherhood so far treating you?
Fantastic and exhausting. More exhausting than the crypto market, surprisingly, but not by much. Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't sure if you'd be able to continue your threading. Once like the infant hit, like I know that my brother recently gave birth like 9 months ago, and he's just dropped off.
I should try and find out on Twitter. Somebody actually charted out like the number of tweets that I've done per day and the length of threads, and showing that it dropped off after fatherhood started. Like they are shorter and less frequent right now, but
No,
it's starting to ramp back up. So we're getting there, getting in the groove of things.
now that's got to be a bear market thing when they're doing technical analysis on your thread size.
Right? Yeah, that feels like there might be some better indicators to be using.
I don't know.
The
That
number
one
of
seems pretty
tweets that
good.
I've done.
Well, let's go ahead and get started though with like the real stuff, because like we had like earlier this month, I feel like there was like just this exhausting torrent of news. Like every day was a new like
Mhm.
regulatory attack on some different protocol. And then thankfully the past couple of weeks seem like they've like calmed down somewhat. I wouldn't say they've calmed down completely. There's still like a bunch of stuff that's been happening. But it's at least I've been able to catch my breath just a little bit. Has that been your sense as well, that it's kind of like somewhat calmed down?
Yes and no. I kind of worry that it's it's the calm at the eye of the storm.
Mm.
And people think I'm extremely bearish and biased in this, but especially towards some of the stuff that we see going on with the current investigations around, SEC actions and CFTC actions against Binance and Justin Sun and things like that. Um, a lot of those, the CFTC investigation into Binance, for example, the depth and scope of that doesn't match regular CFTC actions. Like that feels like interagency coordination, and I can't help but focus in on the fact that CFTC dropped their report one day before they had to go ask Congress for an upgrade in funding. Right, so it was very nicely timed. But other agencies who don't have that challenge didn't have to push forward on a release if they have one. And so normally agencies will try and release coordinated actions around the same time, but there might be pull forward. And I can't help but worry that there is more lurking action out there from other agencies that may not have hit yet, just because it's still beyond the scope of the CFTC. And then I think there is a lot of focus on what the SEC has been doing around actions. Their fight with Ripple, their Wells notices, their fight with Coinbase. But I'm actually a little more worried on some of the regulatory rulemaking side that they're focused on. Like, Gensler is hinting that he wants to push forward this rule around ATS or alternative trading systems, where any, as he calls it, informational portal that brings together market sellers and buyers should be categorized as an ATS, and he wants to use that to like lump Uniswap under needing to register as an exchange. But what it would in turn do is mean like Etherscan and your Bloomberg chat terminal, and even arguably in the most generous interpretation, something like Twitter, could all be argued to be exchanges because you're bringing together buyers and sellers. And that kind of stuff doesn't need a court case for him to make a rule. Like he could make a rule and then it has to be challenged afterwards. And so I worry about that kind of side of things where for sake of his own career or ego, he could just like lob out some ridiculous rulemaking that gets rammed through, and it would be a real curveball for us.
Yeah, it seems utterly crazy to me. Now, now, of course, like they make the rule. It probably like goes through the courts. Maybe it takes a couple years to get through. Probably gets declared like I have to imagine blatantly unconstitutional. But the damage that it would do in that intervening like 2 to 3 years, would there be anything left of crypto Twitter at that point?
Right, exactly. And this is what we've seen the SEC do in court cases, right? Like, you know, Gensler comes out all the time informally and he'll say things like, oh, Ethereum's a security or this, that, and the next thing's a security. Then he goes and picks fights with little projects who have no money to bankroll a legal fight and buries them in multi-year litigation and exploration and paperwork costing millions. But he doesn't come and take on the big cases because that would be actually really challenging for them to do. Like, there's not a viable case for them. I think there's a really good chance they would lose any case they brought forward against Ethereum, for example, in the courts. But they realize that they don't have to win the judgment; they just have to win the fight. And so they can bury an entire industry in paperwork and litigation and chilling effect for years, keeping people away from it, and then the rule can be overturned after that, but it's just like a smoking husk that's left, right? And that's the dangerous play. And actually that's the court case that we saw today that gave me a mild heart attack because the person has the same last name as me, and it was SEC versus Cochran. um, that court case seems to be about this judicial review process and where it falls into the SEC rulemaking. And I've not read it too in depth because it didn't touch crypto, so it wasn't even on my radar. But the summary of it is basically um, that Justice Thomas, in his opinion, is concerned that Congress shouldn't be able to give agencies this administrative review process where they can do things so unilaterally and make decisions and make conclusions that impact industries without a judicial review preceding it and it having to come after. Because right now, if Gensler slams through a rule, that rule can apply whenever he and the other members of his committee decide it starts, and we can challenge it in courts afterwards and overturn it afterwards, but it's already in force. And they're saying, hey, maybe that order of operations isn't the right way for us to be doing things with these agencies.
Yeah, and that was a 9-0 court decision, so that's got to be considered fairly, fairly like real. It's not like a 5-4 where there's a lot of leeway.
Astonishing in this era and political climate in America to get 9 justices on the same page. Somebody has stepped out of line. Yeah.
So does that mean that, like, hypothetically, if Gensler tries to make a rule that, for example, could ban crypto Twitter, theoretically, if you're like one of those smaller fish in the space, that might give you like some leeway to just say like, oh, we're just going to keep operating, and we think that we would have such a slam dunk case in the courts?
Like the decision doesn't come down in a way that like gives precedent there. It was more in the opinion of the decision that this comes. So this is kind of like the justice is making a warning shot and saying, hey, Gensler, we think the SEC is a little bit out of their lane and overreaching here, and we don't like how you're kind of stepping on the toes of the judiciary. Stay in line, or else next time, you'll find that the opinion isn't the only thing. It's actually going to be in the decision, right? Because there's basically the formal decision and outcome of the case that establishes precedent, but then justices can write an opinion and interpretation and explain their thoughts, right? And so it's kind of in that informal part where they're making that warning shot right now. But we could see it move into something more formal in the future.
Okay. I really want to keep a bias towards like optimism. So, what's some hopium that we can get from all this stuff going on with the SEC? I was watching the budget hearings. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. Time is like I can't keep track of time anymore. And this was the House that was looking at whether they should like basically like what sort of level of funding they should give to the SEC. And Gensler, I mean, I'm biased, but he didn't come off like very well in that hearing. I was a little disappointed because all the Congress people were hammering him because it was like now the Republicans control the Congress. But to my disappointment, they weren't hammering him on cryptocurrency. They were hammering him on like environmental rules, which I'm kind of disappointed because I like the environment. Like that's not the piece I'd really want to challenge him on. But
Right.
it did sound like there's
think,
talk about budget cuts for the SEC, which might be nice.
Yeah, there is, and you know what? They've also had a pretty huge talent churn under Gensler. They are understaffed, and I think there's been a lot of top brass talent over the years who have left because they don't like how the agency is being run. But I don't think that's going to necessarily change anytime soon. I think the optimistic things that I see is we're starting to see more challenge in the courts to overreach and popular opinion around multiple facets of where the SEC is overreaching. But I think they've picked the wrong fight with their Coinbase case. I think Coinbase can easily take them to task on that. I'm actually hopeful that um, Gensler might overreach again on some other cases, maybe something around staked ETH or with USDC or something like that in the future. Cases that are pretty clear cut in terms of what can and can't be done. I think they're going to face some challenges around the pressures that they've worked with other agencies to shut down banks and payment rails and things like that, and kind of stave off crypto because I think once again it was a matter of overreach. And you know, I don't think we have great regulators in America right now. But what I do fall back on is at least in high level courts. It's a remarkably plugged in, intelligent, and fair judiciary across many facets, but especially when it comes to financial regulation and financial law in America. People deeply, deeply understand the importance of that. And we've seen that in the circuit courts where SEC, CFTC usually do their filings, those judges have no problem taking them to task when they overreach. And I think that's well worth being optimistic about that we've suffered because we've been in a kind of no man's land, but when we actually go toe to toe in the courts and get bigger players in the courts, you know, not just small projects, usually those outcomes are actually pretty good and it gets precedent on the books where we can actually say, hey, this has been decided, right? The challenge here is Gensler has refused to give a rule book because he knows he can't give a rule book that has the outcome he likes. So by forcing his hand and requiring him to give a path forward, there's going to be some concessions and give clarity that's needed for crypto and DeFi.
Yeah, when I talked with some of the Frax Flywheel team the other week, DeFi Dave used to be a former Hilturn, so he's was pretty plugged into the scene. But they're all fairly optimistic long term. Like they also agree that kind of like, of course, America's getting some stuff wrong now, but they say that generally it doesn't mess these things up in the long run. So they're fairly optimistic that like with some of the stablecoin legislation they see, which they're optimistic about, they think that America's going to get this right. We just have to kind of go through this like short-term struggle in which like unfortunately the casualties are going to be, you know, regular Americans and a lot of the companies trying to start things here in America.
Yeah, I mean, the US has this remarkable history of getting technology right at the wrong time and having a backlash to anything new at first until they realize they're like losing the foot race. So, like, even with the internet, you know, when the internet first came around, there was a huge movement among regulators and congressional folks to require you to get a license to run a website, right? And then as the internet kind of proliferated outside of America, they realized we're going to lose this foothold here. We're going to lose this opportunity by overregulating. And they very quickly, you know, did a 180 on these discussions. There was even discussion about, you know, should email be part of the postmaster process and count as federal mail, right? Like we didn't know how to deal with this, and you have regulators that are like 60 to 70-year-old people who have no idea about this technology. You're going to get weird reactions. But as soon as they see, oh no, you know, some other country is like beating us to the punch on adopting this technology, That's a real good rallying cry for American politicians. And I think as we see Europe make progressions in their adoption of cryptocurrency, and we see China full bore ahead on their kind of CBDC, we'll see America start to play catch up. Just like their reaction to AI right now is, hey, we can't let China win on AI. As we see more and more examples of countries really benefiting from blockchain technology, American regulators will realize the need to play catch up.
Yeah, I'm sort of reluctant to hammer on the like ethnocentrism drum to be able to rally support for these things. But like, what is your read on what is going on? So I visited Hong Kong in January, and I got to talk to some people on the ground who, they're like, this is real. Like, this is actually coming. China really wants Hong Kong to compete with Singapore to become a crypto hub as a way of kind of allowing mainland China buffered access to cryptocurrency and as a way of just getting money into their system. But I've trouble like trusting or knowing actually what's going on in China, even having visited there, because like there's so much kind of weird propaganda filters that get applied to that Chinese news. What is your read on what's going on in the kind of East Asia region?
Yeah, and even when we look at the news kind of the past few days out of Hong Kong, where some of the talking points are now like, suddenly parts, yeah, we want to be a DeFi hub, but, DeFi projects will have to apply for SFO licenses and things like that. Um, it's, it's back and forth. And my read on it is China views it the same way they view Western companies operating in China, the same way they view access to American markets. Uh, they want it in a way that just gives people enough of a bite that they feel they have the access to it, but that China can still control it, right? So like you can access the web, but it's behind the Great Firewall and it's limited and censored. You can deal with U.S. companies, but those U.S. companies have regional licensing that takes place and all filters through um, Chinese administration and things like that. So I don't think it is as blanket hopeful as optimists want, right? Like when we look at some of the listings that people were talking about, um, they were saying, oh well, everybody in China is going to get to trade um, Bitcoin, and it's no, people in China can trade on the stock market a Bitcoin futures ETF that is run by a Chinese state administered broker dealer. That's not the same thing, right? That is not freedom of money. The country that creates a digital yuan where you have to spend a certain amount and they can set what categories you spend it in, and they can charge you interest on it if your money is idle. That's not the same country that is going to want you to have a completely sovereign Bitcoin or Ethereum wallet, right? So they understand that this is out there and there's opportunities to capitalize on, and there's opportunities and there's an appetite for it that they want to satiate. But that doesn't mean that they're going to just rip down the walled garden. They're going to find a way to kind of uh, bring that into the same way they bring the internet into China, but behind a great firewall. They're going to have their own version of that. And so I think the optimism is misplaced because this industry is always hungry for optimism, but especially in the past 6 months where we've had like 100 black swan events. We've had an infinite lifetime of 100-year events happen in the past 6 months. We want good narratives. We want to look on the bright side of things, and I get that. I just don't know if we're going to see that from the countries that have had the longest history of having controlled currency and controlled access to the internet. It doesn't reconcile for me.
To what degree do you think it's just China seeing the headlines coming out of the US and trying to needle the United States with headlines of their own?
I don't know if that's what it is. I think I'm definitely no expert on Chinese policy and how they deal with kind of the social aspects. I think we've seen a little more in the past 5 years. China understanding that people have access and exposure to culture and trends that exist outside of China, and a desire for that. And if they don't get that, it's a lot harder to have this happy, cohesive, shared prosperity society. that they want. And so giving them ways to taste that is kind of the opiate of the masses. It placates society. They feel that hey, we've got access to Bitcoin. We're not missing out on this thing that we could have if we were in America. And so they feel better about it, having access to it, and that's enough for them to not kind of push back against policy. And so I think it may be kind of a method of, well, let's give them a little controlled taste of it so that they don't, seek that it's not a rallying point to seek more of it.
Yeah, I feel like we're just setting up for another China bans Bitcoin headline this summer that's going to cause a 50% price dump.
I mean, it wouldn't be a crypto cycle without it, right? It happens I think since since I was in crypto, I think I've seen that headline like 40 times. It happens every year without fail, multiple times. So it's around the corner for sure.
When did you first get into crypto?
So I first got into crypto sometime in 2013, and I actually ended up late 2013, early 2014, working at a Canadian Bitcoin exchange. But before that, I was also been around a ton with Dogecoin and like helping moderate their subreddit during the time when they sent the Jamaican bobsled team to the Sochi Olympics and put the Dogecoin logo on a NASCAR and all those kind of fun, crazy early crypto events. So that was an absolute blast. But I've been playing around with it since pretty early on.
Oh, nice. Do you take any breaks in that time? That's like almost 10 years, which is, it's tough to keep focused for like 1 year.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't as focused on the industry for a while. I ended up spending a few years where I was working at a privacy-focused search engine, and I was still like investing in the space and keeping up with it, but not as full time. But other than that, crypto has kind of been where I've been focused for most of the past decade, because I think it is that pivotal technology, and I think people just kind of underestimate how long it takes a technology to become adopted and ubiquitous. Like, if you actually break down the story of the internet, it took 60 years for the internet to become this ubiquitous thing that's in our pocket. And I think you're probably old enough to remember that even 10 years ago, the internet wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today, right? Like, maybe you tweeted from your flip phone, maybe, but probably not, right? Like, your internet was this thing on the computer that you logged into at times, and we take for granted how ingrained it is in our life nowadays. But that's been such a long journey, and I think that crypto's on that same journey where it will be as impactful as the internet. We're just in such early innings.
Yeah, and also on top of that, the internet didn't face like hostile regulators at every turn, which I have to imagine, even though it can't permanently offset the adoption of crypto, it's going to add some friction on the margins.
Yeah, it's definitely been tough, and I think part of that is that we tie the technological success too easily to financial success here, and so it creates these weird dichotomies where users very easily get bought in, but also burned. And like, I hate regulations like the accredited investor law. I think it is an absolutely stupid way to fence off people investing in startups. But I get the motivation because I invest heavily in the VC world, and I see kind of the pitch decks that come across, and I see other angel investors cutting checks for these things where I'm like, well, that is stupid and smoke and mirrors. And even if it was to work, it's going to take you 40 years to get your money back, not 4 years. And the complexity in being able to understand how long it takes to build and refine a technology product, but then grow and scale it. Like, everything that people see as these overnight startup successes are businesses that started 10 to 15 years ago, and they may have just come on your radar in the past few years. But that person built it from a one-person startup to a 200-person team before it became the quote-unquote overnight success.
Yeah, and you've been around for a lot of cycles. I also joined around 2014, maybe late 2013. And it's like, when you've been around this long, you mentioned like you see a lot of the same like news stories. You also see a lot of the same products, right? Like so many of the companies I see launch, I've seen launch and fail 100 times. And it's not that they're necessarily going to fail this time, because maybe this time like who knows, maybe something's changed. Maybe there's like enough more adoption, or like enough more like infrastructure, or who knows what. But it just like, you just see these things on Echo, right?
Yeah, and there's two kind of caveats to that. You can be right at the wrong time, right? Like there's a great example of, there was probably 30 major startups who wanted to do Netflix style streaming back in the early 2000s, but we didn't have enough people with high-end broadband for that to make sense, right? So Netflix made that migration at the right time and was successful. But then there's things that just don't work and don't make sense no matter how you plug them in, and like the one that's always a red flag for me, anytime we get to a cycle where people are talking about like IoT streaming payments for charging your car or supply chain tracking, that's when I know that like we're reaching a peak in a cycle. So if you're out there and you see someone being like, "Oh, this fund just made a $50 million investment in this blockchain to track the supply chain of like tomatoes as they ship from Europe to America," that's it. It's time to sell, right? We're going into a downtrend.
My signal is like very clear, because every time we're like right at the top, my parents ask about buying, and somehow like this happened again last time. My mom asked about buying Ethereum versus Bitcoin, and instead of like selling everything I had, I showed her how to create a Coinbase account, and somehow it just didn't register. Like I was
Oh
like, what am I
no.
doing?
Yeah, yeah. See, and it's tough. It's tough to track these things because there's so many of them. They're often subtle when we come across them in a kind of a linear time fashion, and there's so much to be caught up on, and often don't. We're often standing too close to the picture. Like I often joke, the markets are like a pointillism drawing, where if you stand right up against it, all you see is little dots. You can't make out the picture. If you stand back, all the dots begin to form a picture. And so I've actually, each cycle I maintain this list that I check every morning, and it's like market peak warning criteria, and I've got all these things of like different phases of capitulation. What do we expect to see in the market trends? What do we expect to see on CT? And like all my little red flags. And I go down that list every single morning to try and give myself this forcing function of like, are we reaching a peak, right? Am I euphoric is the first question on that list, right? And there's like 70 criteria, but the biggest one is, am I euphoric? And then it's like, okay, if I'm ever euphoric, I probably should take at least some money off the table.
I think the one that I somehow I missed also was the brands all talking with each other. It was like Bud Light was saying, we are going to make it, friend, and then I forget, like Arby's or something. No, Adidas like was writing back, and I was just like, in my lizard brain, I was like, oh, this is it. Like brands are in. Once the brand's money moves in, it's going to go higher from here. But what actually happened was everything collapsed.
It's always a good one.
Let's jump back really quickly to Coinbase, because we talked a bit about it, and Coinbase actually like a really good example of one of these companies that's been chopping wood. Back in 2014, I remember the story was like Brian Armstrong was like literally going to knock on the door of every single Silicon Valley VC and educate them on Bitcoin, and most slammed the door in his face, some listened to him and then kicked him out, but eventually he of course built Coinbase into what it is today. And you're saying that you think that the SEC kind of overstepped there. Do you know or have you been following closely what's happened since the SEC issued the Wells notice? Have they actually gone through and announced an investigation or anything?
I mean, I don't think there's been anything else too public. These things tend to move slowly in the public eye, and then there's usually a lot behind the scenes. My hunch is that the Wells notice is far-reaching, but where the SEC feels that they have the strongest argument is on the staked Ethereum product. And I actually built out a little info website that's is ethereumsecurity.com, and it runs down why Ethereum is not a security, and I'm updating it to add in staked ETH, because there's all this legal analysis that exists that you can do, and there's a few different tests. People make the mistake thinking that the Howey test is the only way for something to be a security, and it's not. There are a number of different analyses that can categorize something as a security.
It's like 100 or something, right?
So there's hundreds of different things that could be securities, and the two most common tests are the Howey test and then a test called Reeves. And Reeves is really dangerous because Reeves is like anything that resembles a security could be a security if it resembles enough of the characteristics, which is just such a vague test compared to Howey. Um, but when we look at staked Ethereum, the real question comes down to, is the servers kind of normalizing um, payments and giving you like a guaranteed income, or are they a service provider, right? So it's not illegal for somebody to host as a service a node and you to pay them a cut of earnings on a variable basis for running that validator node for you. And so my argument is that it's pretty clear that Coinbase is doing that because they're passing through the payments. Like if you get slashed, you're losing on that payment. What Kraken was doing is normalizing the yield and giving you a guaranteed yield where they were kind of like pooling it all together. And so that's a very different legal case. I think the SEC has overreached into this fight with Coinbase because Coinbase has incredibly good lawyers, incredibly good resources, and is as by the book as possible, and has been asking the SEC for guidance at every single turn and getting the door slammed in their face. And I don't think there's a judge in any district that's going to look at that and think this is a U.S. regulator acting in a fair and reasonable manner.
Yeah, I even saw some speculation that the SEC like might issue the Wells notice but might not follow through. Just because of like I keep drawing parallels in my mind to the Ripple case, which the SEC filed this years ago, and from an outside perspective, it appears to have just become a huge boondoggle. Like I can't imagine that the SEC is happy about where it went, and I have to imagine Coinbase would only fare worse. But is this just like my crypto bias showing? And do you think that like internally the SEC is like, oh, okay, well, the case didn't quite go where we wanted, but at least like it showed the cops are on the beat or something?
Yeah, I do. I think the SEC probably thinks the Ripple case is actually still going quite well, not as good as they wanted, but I think they're showing that. I think what they want to show, especially Gensler, who has political aspirations for higher office,
Yeah,
maybe a
good luck.
treasury post or something like that. He wants to show um, just that they're willing to take on the fight and not let people get away with things, and so they'll drag it out and they're not a private company. They don't have budget constraints in the same way. They might get budget cuts from Congress, but really their ability to field a legal team to spend time on something doesn't mean they're losing money. It just means they're not prosecuting something else. Um, so I think that they probably view it in a better light than we do in the crypto industry. And I do think it's a more nuanced case. I don't think it's as clear cut as Coinbase's cases would be. Ripple has done some things and had some structures that I think if they launched now today with better understanding of the regulatory space in the U.S., they would have different structures. Um, I think the Coinbase case will probably proceed. I think it'll feel like it's dead for a while because what will be happening after they get the Wells notice is all this documentation will be compiled and lawyers from the SEC and Coinbase will be emailing back and forth for eons. And that's what sunk a lot of these small businesses like the library protocol. When you get served a Wells notice, you can expect a seven-figure legal bill just in like preparing the documentation and responding to the SEC before you even have your day in court. So it can be a nightmare.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you think that like America tends to get these things right in the courts. Is your opinion that the current securities framework is like pretty good and it could like be tweaked a little bit maybe, but useful to apply to cryptocurrencies? Or do you think that it would be useful to kind of throw out the book on it and sort of rewrite the regulation from scratch?
So yeah, I'm torn. I view it like a lot of the regulations in the U.S. where I actually agree with the core premise of the regulation. Like it was designed to protect people from snake oil salesmen and counterparty risk, and that makes sense, right? We want that. We don't want grandma being scammed out of her pension fund every week. Um, but I think the literal readings of the law and the fact that it hasn't been updated and refined make it challenging to apply and stupid to continue to apply. and not give clarity on, right? So we could have never imagined in 1935 that there would be a way to facilitate a trade between two parties without trust or counterparty risk, right? Because there would have been no technology to do that. And so we had to have these regulations. Now that we have a system that can be truly autonomous with no counterparty risk, we don't account for that anyway in the law. And that's what needs to be defined. I view it just as like America eventually updated its laws to consider corporations to be people because we never imagined that a company initially would get so big that it could have its own liabilities without having a single person liable. So we updated the law and said, hey, corporations are people. You can take them to court. They can be liable in and of themselves. And we need to do the same for blockchains and smart contracts. We need to recognize that these things are so novel that we need to update some of our laws to account for them. And I think the securities framework that we have in America is decent, but we need to view what is and isn't a security and what needs the protections of a centralized market in that framework. So if you can have something that is entirely transparent, immutable, and trustless, that's okay for people to deal with because they're infinitely informed like they would be on a exchange where somebody's giving them, quarterly earnings releases, right? I can get that. I can read Yearn's quarterly releases. I can do that every day on the blockchain, right? And so I think we need to be able to update some of our understanding of how these things work to account for this novel system.
What's your read on some of the proposed legislation going around for stablecoins? I know there's been some drafts that have been circulating, and some people have said that it's like fairly positive, the way direction they see that going.
I don't know. It's a tough one. Um, I don't think stablecoins need to be as regulated as some of these proposals are going to be. I think a lot of the biggest advocates for those are ones who are already established stablecoin businesses because it's really easy to climb up the ladder when there's no regulation and then kick the ladder out from under you to make a moat. Um, I think we've had like we didn't apply stablecoin regulation to travelers' checks back in the 80s and 90s, right? Like Amex didn't actually have a banking license and was just like holding money and issuing redeemable travelers' checks as paper. Um, there are systems out there that didn't fall under advanced legislation to do that. I worry that we're going to pigeonhole the creation of these stablecoins into banks or non-banking financial institutions and be too restrictive on them. Like the legislation is calling for higher cash reserves than a bank is required to make, which makes it really hard to be a for-profit stablecoin and not take on risk. Um, that'll force them to take on riskier and riskier bets to make a profit, which really undermines the stability of the stablecoin, as we've seen in the current market turmoil. Um, I hold my breath on it. I think when we look at what someone like Circle is doing, they're doing it right. They're taking a conservative approach and they're showing that the private market can facilitate this and can kind of demand the responsible approach from a vendor. Um, I worry about over regulating it. Um, I guess time will tell.
Here in the comments, Deanie points out the language resembles is vague, which I think
Oh
is a good.
yeah, in Reeves, yeah, that's why it's such a dangerous kind of test and one that is tough to fight in courts. Basically, what they say is you could look at any type of um, security that exists and go down the list of criteria, and if it sufficiently resembles a security, then it should be a security. And there's some court cases that get into, well, what does resemble mean and how much should it resemble? But it doesn't have nearly as much established clear precedent as the Howey test does. The Howey test was a vague statement at first, and then it was through hundreds of follow-up cases that reference back to it that we got those like three core rules of the Howey test. We don't have that yet for Reeves, and that makes it dangerous. And I think if the SEC wanted to go after somebody like a Circle, that's how they would do it. They would argue that USDC resembles a money market account or a tokenized deposit of a money market account. It does resemble it, but it's not one, right? Especially because there's no interest being passed on to the user. But the question is, how much does it need to resemble? So I think that's where we have to fall back on this idea that we've got pretty reasonable judiciary and multiple levels of judiciary that you would fight that case up in, and they would say, well, no reasonable person would think it resembles a money market account if you're not gaining interest from it. But it's a dangerous test that's on the books that I don't think the SEC has kind of pulled out of their quiver yet. I think it's ammo that they've been holding on to for some big fights, and I worry that we will see that in the courts at some point.
What about FedNow?
Yeah, I mean, 24/7 transfer network is great. A lot of people say it makes crypto obsolete, which is bizarre because crypto is not just a replacement for Swift. It does a whole lot of things. I think there will always be private market demand. But we also have to remember that FedNow is a U.S. system for U.S. banks and the U.S. dollar, and a lot exists outside of that, where crypto, even if crypto only had one product, like you could only create one blockchain, and it was a FedNow competitor, just the very fact that it could be borderless and multi-currency would make it better, let alone that it would be self-sovereign and not controlled by U.S. regulators. So I don't see FedNow being an issue in that capacity. I think FedNow could resolve a lot of our challenges in liquidity transfer now that SEN and Signet networks are gone. It depends on if they let crypto exchanges bank with FedNow or not. I don't see it as an issue. I also have very little faith in any technology that's ever been built by a government. Like, who has gone to a DMV website and thought it was a good web portal, or like doing your border travel and getting all your documents? The federal government is not known for cutting edge technology, and this has been delayed by like 4 different times now, 6 to 12 months each. So I'm not concerned.
Yeah, I definitely share that frustration, having had multiple like bad issues with both state and federal level interactions. Like nothing malicious, just the red tape and the bureaucracy of things, and things get lost. And when it happens, like you're kind of out of luck. My sort of like, oh, go ahead.
Government websites are still like, download this PDF, fill it in. You have to use Internet Explorer 10, print it off, and fax it back to us, right? Like, so yep. I'm not concerned.
But like my unpopular opinion, I know I'm not just saying that, like I've gotten some heat for it before, is that like a well-designed CBDC could actually be good. I just don't have faith that, especially given the kind of lacking credibility in the current like administration, or even past administrations, really, we've had kind of a string of losers. I just don't think that they're going to be able to pull off a CBDC that would be considered palatable to the general public. But I think if they had better standing, it actually could be a good thing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think people forget how much of our current payment system is run by the Fed. Like, the fact that you can do ACH or wires is all because of Fed-run technology. I think you could have a CBDC where, as long as you're still allowing private alternatives, and your CBDC was like, anybody can download a Watcher validator node but not be an issuer, and wallets have some zero knowledge proof for spending so that they're quasi-private even from the government. Yeah, sure, you could do that correctly. I think there's probably no appetite to take on the technological challenge of doing it correctly,
and that's just it. They're like speed running to all the bad parts.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's kind of a bummer, because I kind of feel like if they don't get the buy-in, it's going to get heavily politicized, right? Like you're already seeing some people on both the right and the left like going out and criticizing FedNow because it resembles a CBDC.
Yeah, it's wild to me how everything is getting politicized these days.
Oh yeah,
including issues you didn't think could ever be political. I think we've done ourselves a lot of damage as an industry through the proliferation of so many scams and not kind of being as self-regulating as we need to be, because so many retail investors have genuinely gotten hurt in this chaos, that's what's brought the hate and kind of fueled that hatred, especially on the the Warren clusters of the political spectrum. Like it's not entirely unfounded. We've done a bit of that to ourselves, and I think if we stopped selling Shiba Inu to everybody, maybe we'd be a little better off as an industry.
No, we sort of, like, another unpopular opinion I have is that we sort of deserve it because we haven't done a good job of cleaning up our own mess. We haven't done a good job of self-policing. And you mentioned earlier that like the SEC, like, and all these regulators, they do have a mandate to clean things up, and unfortunately, they've been in some levels like also bad, if not worse. But like, I keep saying that if, for example, like the SEC was run by Zach XBT, like I don't think anyone would have any issues with that because like he has
exactly.
And if we were like building ourselves an SEC from the ground up, it might actually be a force for good, right? Like it might like have a multi-sig that could blacklist Tether in the event of hacks, although probably not a multi-sig because that's too slow. But there is like, I think the community would agree to good regulation. It's just we're not really seeing them taking the leadership on that front.
I mean, maybe, and that comes back to this part of what makes this even more challenging than other new technology is people's financial success can be tied to it. Like there's a whole lot of people out there who were shilling Luna who knew exactly how that was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at it in depth, there's no other way for that to end. Like there were rational, educated, financial background people looking at that and saying, "Hey, come buy this," and for a fact that they knew how that would end one day.
Yeah, but 20% yield,
really profitable. Yeah, right. And so everybody was taking that gamble and pushing that gamble, hoping they would get out or hoping that someone else would buy their bags. And that's why this industry sometimes deserves the pain it gets, because there's a lot of people who knew exactly what they were pushing.
So do you think the fact that they like nabbed Do Kwon and are throwing the book at him as well as SBF and whatnot, do you think that restores any standing from the regulators?
Oh God, no.
No.
If anything, it makes them feel like they're on point, right? Like the two of the most high profile things in this space ended up being utter scams, right? Like, SBF was put on this absolute pedestal and got the graces of Gensler and half of Washington and ended up, spitting in their face. Like, there is nothing we as an industry could have done that could have been any worse than making a politician look like a fool. Because they will forgive a lot, you can bribe away a lot, but if you make them look like a fool, my God, they will go scorched earth. There's nothing politicians hate more than being made to look like a fool.
So Elizabeth Warren is raising her anti-crypto army. And my first thought is that it's really tough to build a political movement in the negative, right? Like it's easy to like align a group of people around some positive cause, but to align people against something, like you can definitely like whip up a firestorm, but it's tough to build like a solid political movement. But then, I say she's a senator, so she obviously understands politics better than I do.
Yeah, I think hatred's actually a really powerful thing. I've often joked with friends that if I was to ever create like a startup that was a dating app, instead of trying to make compatibility on like your shared interests, I would do it on your shared hatreds. Because like hatred is a remarkably powerful and galvanizing thing. And I think we're seeing it a lot in America right now. And I think that's why she can galvanize people around this is like, I think galvanizing around a positive has a longer lasting impact and can deal with more friction. But rallying around hatred is very visceral, right? It's a quick burning fire, and it can be damaging.
So
I think she's going to find a decent sized army in kind of that rallying call.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room. And you might storm out at this point, but there are rumors floating around that you're actually Canadian. Can you address these?
Yeah, I don't live in the U.S. I just know everything there is to know about U.S. politics and regulation because Canada's boring. So,
I know it's like in
um,
order to get insight into the U.S. system, we had to bring on a Canadian.
yeah, and it is just like people are often surprised to learn I'm not a lawyer, and they're like,
That was my
"But all
next
you
question,
write
actually,
is
because you
like
got the
legal things." Yeah,
suit.
I'm not a. I do have a suit. No, I love the law. I read law books for fun. At some point in my education, I had planned to go into law, and then I just didn't. I found other pathways, and I realized that you don't need to go spend time at law school and working as a law intern fetching coffee for partners in order to understand how the law works. So you can read it, be well versed in it, and hire lawyers to sign the final paperwork.
I also had like a
Um,
wild hair to
I,
like just take like read through the online materials, like take an online course and like swoop my way in the test and see if I could get myself barred.
yeah,
Just as like a
exactly. I,
night class type thing.
I see somebody asked in the chat, do I have any thoughts on how Canada is treating the crypto industry?
Oh yeah,
I have lots of thoughts. We are
yeah.
probably, unfortunately, one of the only places that is doing as bad of a job as the U.S. Um, we're maybe one or two steps better. Canada has the challenge. We don't have a federal rule maker like the SEC. We have one for each province, and so sometimes there can be um, a bit of ambiguity and divide between the rules that happen in Ontario versus Alberta or something like that. Um, what we're seeing here is that regulators were very quick to bring out what they call a sandbox, where if you're working in crypto, issuing crypto, you can kind of get these exemptions where you work closely with a regulator and they allow you to operate using crypto, even though it's not necessarily on the law books. Um, those sandboxes are pretty limited. So it's if you have any instant payment thing like a Bitcoin ATM or purchasing online that goes to a self custody wallet that's blanket approval, which is great because we don't even have that clarity in the U.S. But the sandbox is like even some of our biggest broker dealers are told, you can sell people the top 10 coins, and so you can sell Litecoin, but you can't sell Curve or something like that
Hmm.
on your trade book. Um, or you can sell Bitcoin Cash, but you can't sell Yearn, right? Like so, I think we missed the mark a little on that. Um, but it's evolving. It's slow, but evolving, and I'm hopeful we'll get it right. One of the challenges that we also have is that securities law of what is a security is different in Canada. Once again, because of a very old law. So things like USDC are probably very fairly a security within Canada because in Canada we consider security anything that is a redeemable deposit held in trust, and that by definition is a stable coin. So you have to kind of lean on other outdated laws in Canada, like we have this one from 1835 called the Bills of Exchange Act, which is what allowed airline travel vouchers and oh shoot, what was it I was talking about earlier? Travelers checks to exist within Canada. It was kind of an exemption framework carved out for them. All these kinds of things. You have to kind of build a stablecoin that would be modeled around a legal wrapper like that if you wanted it to be in Canada. And even then, it's probably touch and go if it needs to exist in a sandbox. So I think Canada is going to have some pain in the fact that now regulators are pushing against that. So we'll probably get cut off a little on stablecoin rails. Um, but at least the Ontario Securities Regulator has expressed interest in working with issuers within their sandbox to talk about um, stablecoins, and the Canadian Mint has been exploring CBDC and crypto-based payment rails as far back as 2013, and they've done a lot of really good in-depth reports on the technology and stuff. So we don't have the political backlash hatred that we see in the U.S. We don't have a Warren equivalent who's like we should ban crypto. We're just really slow moving and not quite hitting the nail on the mark yet. So it's too restrictive, but maybe we can eventually get there.
But in the chat, AMF was asking about removing the USDT tether from the exchanges.
Yeah, so that's the same. I would guess that in the next 3 months, USDC and DAI, maybe not DAI, USDC will get removed as well under the fact that Canada thinks deposits are securities. Um, USDT was even quicker because it's just not transparent enough for the Canadian regulators, and they were concerned about risks of fraud there, and so they moved really quick on forcing the removal of USDT. And I can kind of understand that a regulator's job is to mitigate that unknown risk of something at that scale, because unlike the US, if Canada had a major exchange implode, or financial fallout among some of our banks or stuff like that, our economic system is not nearly as large as the US. We probably would have an outsized impact across the Canadian economy. And so I understand why they're walking with caution, because like Tether being a $60 billion thing, if that implodes, it's bad for the US. It's devastating for Canada if we have outside exposure to it, because we're like a 20th of the economic size.
Got it. Got it. So I remember like about a year, maybe two ago, there was the trucker protests in Canada, which a lot of people were saying, oh, this is actually like the perfect kind of use case for Bitcoin, and expected that was going to be a big Bitcoin narrative. But then I remember, I think it was you was saying like people were saying that didn't really understand the Canadian system.
Yeah, Canada has a number of different emergency powers, laws, and regulations around money payment that don't exist in the U.S., including the right of seizure of centralized capital if it's related to laundering, un-KYC, cross-border payments, et cetera, et cetera. And so my point was, I don't like that that's there, but there is legal grounds to do it. And the way that some of the payments that were actually seized were really sketchy, and the way that they were being processed through cross-border funneled payments into un-KYC'd wallets, it was questionable origins and blatant cross or money laundering in many of the cases. Were there some cases of legitimate users trying to withdraw from legitimate services caught up in that? Probably. Um, but for the vast bulk of it, they have the right to place a seize and hold on that until the centralized vendor, who was, a money transmitter, provides adequate KYC. Like if you send a $10,000 plus transaction through a money transmitter and you've not provided KYC data, they will freeze that until you do, right? So it's not that they were sending Bitcoin into self-hosted wallets. These were going through all sorts of payment services that have reporting and compliance requirements that Canada had the right to freeze and detain that money. And I think a lot of people picked up that narrative and pushed it in a way that was skewed, saying that was an overreach of powers, and it was like, it's not like they're trying to seize Bitcoin out of your self-hosted wallet.
Are you a fan of Trudeau or no?
I'm not a fan of politicians in general. I
Fair.
think we get a lot
Agreed.
of things wrong. And I try, when it comes to politics, to not take a pro or against on anyone, because the reality is they're going to have some decisions I agree with, and probably a lot I don't agree with, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. Um, and we haven't had a great run of choices here recently either. So,
I mean, we probably can challenge you for worse, because
yeah.
our election's going to be between Joe Biden and Donald Trump again, it looks like. But
it's an old run.
yeah, I ask because like I've been especially as like people have been stepping up the war on crypto, I've been saying that we need to get some of our better faces to run for office, even if we're going to lose. So like in Massachusetts, I was trying to convince Patrick Collins, who's like an outstanding developer and just a perfect like voice for the industry. He's based in Massachusetts, and he says Elizabeth Warren's an embarrassment. So even if he's not going to win, I think he should mount a primary challenge, just to like, so the crypto community can have like a really positive voice out there. And I think you should do the same in Canada, to be honest. I think you should run against Trudeau.
Well, unfortunately, we can't just directly decide to run against the prime minister. It's got to be a party nomination. But I think, aiming for Senate races, I think people underestimate how massive a challenge it can be. Um, but I think there's a lot of opportunity, both in Congress and state Congress throughout America, for crypto voices and people in technology in general to run. And I think what we have to do is, as an industry, back people who are genuinely supportive of the technology or open to it. I think if you looked at some of the last primary cycles, there was a lot of people who um, were educated. You know, there was a whole movement around getting scientists to run for Congress. Um, and some of these scientists come from, technical backgrounds. They're educated, reasonable people who can be engaged in dialogue and were often at least open to being supportive about crypto. And they already had a broader political will behind them than just crypto. I think there's a good opportunity for this industry to begin to support candidates who we can engage with in a meaningful way that are broader than just crypto only candidates, and work our way up. I don't think there's many candidates in the crypto sphere who could mount a successful Senate campaign.
Yeah, that might be true. It might be true. I just I see this as like this is wartime, and we have to start stepping up and doing things that we don't want to do. So a lot of people.
Look, if I thought it was viable, I would do it. It's the reality is that the immense cost, especially for somebody like Warren, who's so party entrenched and has such long name recognition. That's a tough person to dethrone.
Guaranteed loss. 100% it would be a guaranteed loss. There's no way
because industry is going to throw 50 million in funding behind a candidate. Yeah, let's pick off a candidate race that is more contestable and actually try and get a seat.
Right.
Like, there's no point going against somebody who's so entrenched. But if you can have one more voice, or even one voice in the Senate that brings a rational discussion of crypto and a vote backing crypto that is willing to vote on whatever side of the aisle is pro crypto at that time, that's a huge change. And I'm sure there's some junior senator from, I don't know, Wyoming, Tennessee, Iowa. I don't even know who many of the junior senators are in those states, but I'm sure that there's a junior senator in some small state that would have a tough time in a race that was funded by this industry.
Yeah, it's true. You need to get the those swing states and those swing districts and whatnot. But stay open to it, because we could use just more voices, and you would get a ton of attention from crypto Twitter. You get, I'm sure, a bunch of donations, and as long as you're going into it expecting you'd lose and just trying to advance the conversation, I think you could do a lot of good. But let's go ahead and look
maybe one day. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go ahead and I think just the thing is, people don't realize, now a lot of us are of the age where we can do it, and we choose not to. We're much happier sitting at home and crap posting on Twitter. But anyway, let's jump to some of the other points in your bio, because you do a ton of things, right? In addition to, you mentioned a little bit, some of the work that you do as an investor. This is with a fund called, CEHV.
Yes, Cinemain Ventures. So that's just my VC fund. It is just me.
It's just you
investing in everything from crypto to robotics, biotech, anything that I think is a leap forward in productivity or trustlessness.
Got it. What's your sort of investment returns? Have you done pretty well for yourself on this, or?
Well, I mean, I don't have another job, so yeah, it's
Nice.
gone well enough.
Nice. I thought you were also an adjunct professor, though, right?
Yeah, adjunct professors don't get paid worth anything.
I know that. I dabbled in teaching some.
That is something that has been a matter of passion. If you ever find yourselves as an adjunct in academia, especially in Canada, you'd make more as a night shift manager at a fast food joint than you would teaching. It's a major problem. That's something you have to do for the love of it and advancing knowledge. So most of my work has been over the past few years contributing to different protocols that I find interesting, and doing my kind of investing full time.
So just let me quickly share my. I wasn't quite an adjunct professor. I was somehow even lower on the totem pole. I was because I don't know if you remember, like last year or so, I was trying to get you to come and do a guest lecture for the class I was teaching, and mine was just like a night class.
I didn't realize that was you. I didn't make the connection. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was like a night class, so it wasn't like a night Zoom class. So it wasn't even anything, right? But and it probably paid even worse because I'm pretty sure I was well less than minimum wage. But I didn't really care, right? Like because I got to teach about like Python, I got to teach financial analysis, I got to teach Solidity. So these are all just skills like I wanted to, get better at myself anyway. So and like I really enjoyed like the people I met through it. So I was trying to get you to come and like just give a guest lecture, and it would have been like 10-20 minutes. And I remember you were telling me that in order to do that, you needed to fill out like a whole laundry list of forms. I'd have my like student dean get in touch with your people to manage this. And I started down the process,
it was
but
a nightmare.
it didn't go anywhere. So
yeah.
I didn't think you'd be able to even come here and talk without going through a bunch of paperwork.
Well, because this isn't any way related to an academic post. Right?
Okay.
And I'm not teaching this semester, so it gives me kind of even more wiggle room. One of the wonders of being adjunct is like when you're not teaching, those rules don't apply. But yeah, no, some of the hurdles in academia to make sure there's like no conflict of interest and things like that, and no liabilities for the school. It's wild. It's worse than crypto regulation.
That's so funny. I mean, someone's going to be building like an on-chain, like blockchain school if they haven't done it already. And I think it's going to do pretty good.
I don't even know what that would mean, and I am worried about how chaotic it'll be. But
I mean, it's
maybe
it's easy, I think, because if you think about it, like what is Harvard? Harvard is a hedge fund with a like small wing of education attached to it, right?
Yeah, but really, really good education and the credentials.
Yeah, they do that, but that's just a way of kind of, that's the front for their business. Their actual business is this multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, right?
Yeah.
So I think you could get like one of the various like crypto investing groups or something that invests on chain to just attach a small educational wing to it and end up being like the best crypto education around. Talk to me a bit about synthetics. On your bio, at least, you list that as your SC at synthetics.
So Spartan Council is the elected advisory council for synthetics. That's a project that I have, supported for a long time, and I think is important and critical to this space. I think synthetic assets are an incredibly challenging thing to build out, but something that will be pivotal for us long term. And as it stands right now, we've made this major push where synthetics is really embracing its ability to be a protocol. And so the V3 of synthetics isn't synthetics giving you synthetics assets. It's synthetics as an underlying tool that you build whatever protocol you want on top of and tap into that liquidity and pricing and Oracle system and redundancy to kind of have DeFi building blocks as a service. So the first example of that is, Quenta, that is on-chain perpetuals on Optimism, or Lira, that is on-chain options, overtime markets, which is on-chain sports betting. These are all built out on synthetics, and they're using the V2, which is much more restrictive than the V3 launch, which is slowly beginning to roll out. The idea here is that in the future, if you want to build the next Compound or the next Uniswap or the next Bybit but on chain, then you can tap into synthetics and use that liquidity and the synthetic assets to be able to bootstrap it where you don't have the same liquidity problems to start off with, and therefore you don't have to give out as much in terms of incentives to kind of bootstrap a network effect and build useful applications. And so we'll be able to build this ecosystem of DeFi applications on this shared source of liquidity.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been watching synthetics, and it's really exciting. I feel like it floats a bit below the radar, considering kind of the magnitude of what all it's building. Like I occasionally look at the trading fees it's generating, and it's like it's huge. and it's only getting bigger.
Absolutely, and I think this V3 is going to be a huge inflection point for what it's capable of, because now it's really modular, and you can build whatever kind of plug-in DeFi systems you want on top of it, and it really changes kind of the ability for what we can build. It's been restrictive in the past, and we've still seen huge adoption from it, and it's kind of only expanding from here.
I remember sometime back, Synthetics was offering, I think, some synthetic Tesla shares. Is my memory accurate on that?
That is before my time being deeply involved with synthetics, so I don't understand. I'm not familiar with the whole story there. That it was offered for a time and then not offered, and I'm not sure if that bumped up against low demand or complicated regulation.
That was exactly my question.
Yeah, but it's not there anymore, and that's what I know about it.
Suffice to say, yeah.
My hunch is that it is challenging to bring something like that to market, because there is much more complicated multi-jurisdictional regulation. Like, I know there's been some European companies who have tried to bring things like that to market in Europe, where there is a clear path for that, and then got hit by U.S. regulators who say it's underwriting methodologies. The part of the value of Synthetics v3 is that it'll be up to each project that builds on top of Synthetics what oracles they use, what assets they take as collateral, what synthetic assets they want to issue. And they can deal with different levels of regional regulation that fit them. And so if somebody has a path for decentralized synthetic stocks that with their counsel they find to be legal for their users, et cetera, standard disclaimer, not financial advice,
of course, yes.
Nothing. Then they can go and build that, right? And so I think that'll be really interesting and empowering.
Is Synthetics the kind of project you're most excited about within crypto?
Yeah, that's tough, because I think there are so many different verticals in crypto nowadays that it's saying, like, what's the website you're most excited about on all of the internet, or what is the technology you're most excited about on all electronics. It's just like such a big catch-all nowadays. I think Synthetics is probably one of the things that near term I'm most excited about as like DeFi building blocks, because I think DeFi has felt a little stale. We're rehashing kind of the same primitives again and again, and I think Synthetics v3 is going to really unlock the ability to bootstrap new and novel implementations, where we might get kind of this next wave of new DeFi applications happening. I'm excited about a lot of the cross-chain stuff that we're seeing, like your layer zeros, and people building on top of them, like Radiant, who's building a cross-chain Aave competitor, essentially allowing you to borrow on one chain when collateralized on another, and that's the kind of the usability that we really need to advance these systems. And then I'm stoked about a lot of the novel stuff we're doing in the ZK kind of world, and I think ZK Sync and their Era project is probably the one there that I'm most excited about, because I don't think people have even truly begun to understand how efficient their kind of novel approach to ZK implementation is. Like, right now it's a little bit better than some of the other ones on the market, but when you start to apply compression to it, it becomes like so many orders of magnitude better. And then some of the upgrades that you can get into both on Ethereum and on ZK Sync Era continue to make it better where others stall out. And I think just how cheap and how fast we're going to be able to get a transaction there and then build what they call hyperchains on top of it, it's going to be like, it's going to be the kind of technology that you need to bring this to the mass consumer market. This is like finally building the iPhone when all we've had is, massive industrial line telephones from the 40s. It's a really, really big leap.
I have to admit, I didn't think that Ethereum would successfully solve the scaling problems, and I'm eating crow on that a bit. Like, as I seeing the L2s come together and the Ethereum devs hitting all the big upgrades.
we're not there yet, and this is some of the most technologically complex and advanced stuff imaginable. Like if you had asked anybody years ago, would we ever be able to use zero knowledge proofs in like some broad general application, the answer would have been no, right? Like Ethereum has really pushed the boundary here in mathematics and computer engineering when it comes to these proof-based systems. I think we're still only at the start of that, and those who are really building capture the long tail of that race are going to be wildly successful.
And just FYI, I still have like a million questions, so I'm going to keep going as long as I can. My laptop battery is funky and it might crap out at any minute. So if I disappear, it's not that I'm like walking out on you. It's just my computer died, and I'll kill the stream at that point abruptly. Hopefully, it doesn't come to that though.
Right.
So quickly, like I only like recently started looking into ZK Sync and some of the competitors. And I didn't realize quite how many were coming to market. So in your view, what differentiates ZK Sync from some of the other ZK Sync, ZK rollups that are currently launching?
I'm going to try and simplify this for people. I won't get too deep into the tech.
Careful, no education, or you're going to have to ask your school for a waiver.
Yeah. Oh, damn. I want to preface this with the fact that sometimes when you oversimplify things, it's technically wrong, right? It's like in your science high school class when they're like, "Oh, the atom is the smallest thing," and then you get to university and they're like, "No, meet quarks and quasars." So the oversimplification here is that there's a few different ways to deal with zero knowledge proofs. The common one is to build zero knowledge circuits that replicate every single function of the Ethereum EVM. Another way to do it is to separate, that's the EVM compatibility. The other way is to separate out this EVM processing system entirely and build a novel one from scratch. And you can get that 99% the same functionality as Ethereum, but you'll have a few quirks. And then when you do that, there's another choice that you have to make of how much data and what data are you storing on the chain that you're writing to, right? Like the base layer. So most people have opted to create individual circuits for every function and write the entire state data to the main chain, because that's the outcome proofs that you need if you're doing those basic circuits. ZK Sync basically came up with this wild idea that I think even some of their investors early on would have told you, "Oh, that can't be done. It's crazy." And they went out and built an entire zero knowledge proof based system that basically replicates the bytecode compatibility of the EVM and doesn't use circuit replication, and only writes not the entire state, but the difference in the state to the chain. So basically, that's like the way that a zip file or a RAR file on your computer works. They basically take, the data that's in there, and they store a fractional change of that data to make it smaller and more compressed. But they only have to store data that is being changed or modified or is different, and that's how they get smaller bytes. So ZK Sync, their era chain, has upgradability features in its proof engine that I don't think anybody else has. But it's also fully compatible to bytecode, where it doesn't need, if Ethereum adds a new opcode, everybody else has to update. They don't. It stores the state differential, which is much smaller than the full state. And that allows you to be orders of magnitude smaller before even applying what we would call general roll-up compression, which nobody has applied yet. And so you start applying that, and that lead just gets further and further. And while that sounds all technical, that's the overly simplified version of how the inner workings of all these things work. So I think the rate at which they will pull ahead on how small these transactions can be is astonishing. And that opens up some really interesting stuff, like you can update oracles way more quickly for the same cost on zk-sync era than you'll be able to do anywhere else. Or you can trade more quickly against an order book on zk-sync era for the same cost than you could anywhere else, because transactions are so cheap and so fast, comparable even to what it'll be on other ZK implementations. That's not to say other ones won't be good or have novel value or have good compression, right? But that I think as we continue to expand, the way that they will be able to compress is just I can't see anybody else in their current model and even close to competing once we all kind of get to our optimal points.
All
But
right.
that's my personal take and bias.
I'm kind of convinced. I feel like I should run out and buy a bag.
I don't even know if they have a token yet.
I don't think there's anything to buy. Yeah, that's a sad thing. Now, I'm probably mixing this up with like a million other projects that you're also bullish on, but you strike me as one of the people who's more bullish on Conic Finance and have been for some time.
I've been a big advocate for them. They were on my top list. I told people that the rally that we had was maybe a little overstated, and people got really mad at me for selling some, which I did on a public wallet, and was like, "Here's me selling it." I think it is something that is so fundamental and so needed for what Curve wants to achieve with the Curve USD. I think this omni pool structure of being able to kind of have a fluid liquidity across these pools is going to allow us to safely reconcile liquidations, as well as make sure that there is the robust liquidity needed against different pools to sustain Curve USD. And I view it as a crucial kind of part of that play, to the point that it wouldn't even surprise me if part of the team behind Conic is involved with Curve. That's kind of my hunch personally. I don't know how much validity there is to that rumor, but it would not surprise me because it's such a fundamental piece.
People ask me that a lot. I'm pretty convinced they're not, just because they use Solidity.
That's fair. That's a good argument. I could see that.
So, of the team, of the team, there's very few people that I think would deliberately choose Solidity over Viper.
Unless it's just a red hair and they're just throwing you off the scent.
I mean, it could be, but
I mean, at the very least, there's a tight inner working there, because
that I agree with.
You know, Curve USD obviously had this problem of shared liquidity. The mathematics around this are on point. It's non-trivial to design these models, and I think you would only build Conic if you knew Curve USD was in the pipeline and you were incredibly bullish on it, because the omnipool model isn't as interesting in a world where Curve USD doesn't exist. I think it's kind of a key backbone for that.
Right. And there's been some really interesting threads on that elsewhere. So one of the people I know who is like more bearish on the concept of it is like Ben Hauser, who was originally wrote basically all the V1 contracts for Curve, as well as he's like a 10x programmer. He wrote Brownie, Viper, etc., everything. And his take on it was a bit. He didn't know anything specific about Conic. It's just from his time, he'd seen a lot of people try single-sided staking and see like pretty much every time it ended in like massive losses for LPs. So he was kind of bearish on the concept of Conic. Now, so far, obviously, knock on wood, there hasn't been any issues with Conic. And just a disclosure, like I've tossed a little money into a Conic pool just to see how it's going to go. But like, what's your thought on that? Like, is there Chan Ho had a comment on this in the general channel just before we were went live, basically saying there's no alchemy that can quote unquote solve impermanent loss. All you can do is slice the risk and shift it amongst different parties. So what's your thought on like the risk profile and whatnot?
I don't think there's any magical solve for impermanent loss, and that's not my read personally on what I think Conic achieves, right? I think it makes it so that as you have Curve USD and as you have it liquidating across multiple pools and as you have diverse collateral, you could, as an issuer of a stablecoin, find yourself in a situation where under market duress, there's not enough liquidity in the pool that you need to liquidate into to safely liquidate without hampering. So your omni pool model allows you to shift into the preferred pool at that moment in time to scoop up the delta, and in turn take a royalty off of the liquidation to kind of offset the negative impermanent loss and hopefully rebalance it out over time or on the other side of the equation. So my view is that it is like this protective barrier against bad liquidations that would actually hurt you more on impermanent loss than if you didn't have it there, and that your bet is basically a return to the peg and a return to better market conditions, and that the share of the liquidation reward and the curve reward and the rotation between the pools will outweigh any loss that you take on the Omni pool. That's my personal read of it. Whether that will be successful or not, look, it's an experiment. DeFi is always an experiment. We can expect 90% of these things to go to zero, even if they're a good idea and executed well, because this stuff is super complicated, right? It's the first time we've done these things ever. So whether it works out or not, I think the intention is along the right path, and I think it's worth experimenting on, because it could be a very novel system that allows the market to have the robustness that's needed for that stable.
Yeah, we seem to have touched on a point that's got the llamas chattering here. MD LTF in the comments says that the CNC's team's execution has been top notch, which I'd agree with. Like, if nothing else, their website's too gorgeous to have been designed by a curve designer. The AMF asks if there's any thoughts on how they would incentivize the pool rebalancing after Conic emissions are fully distributed.
Yeah, I think my two biggest kind of feedback points for that team have been the emissions model didn't seem as well thought out as it should have been, and their communication has left a lot to be desired. Like the team is being quite silent, and then pops up and it's just like, hey, here's all the updates, and then goes away. I think they do face a challenge in being able to incentivize after the emissions go, and I think the hope that they're banking on is that the kind of upside that you get from Curve USD existing and Curve rewards and things like that should outbalance that. And I can see that in the optimistic case, but Curve USD kind of has to reach a really good use scale before Conic emissions fully distributed for that to work out. So that'll remain to be seen. But I guess I can't see Curve not shifting to start incentivizing Curve USD pools over things that have 3 curve in them, because that would be to their benefit. There should be enough demand, I would imagine, for Curve USD to kind of help offset that. But I do think it's a gamble, and I kind of wish they had thought that part out a little more.
Yeah, no, it's that's interesting. Actually, we talked about it in a fair amount of